find repeating names in your family tree? Or do you see unusual names among your ancestors? Well, in this video, I'm exploring common naming patterns that we see within the family trees. Hey there, I'm Lisa Lisson with Are You My Cousin, and I am a genealogy expert with over 15 years of experience helping others find their ancestors. And on this YouTube channel, I share my best strategies, tools, and tips for uncovering your family history. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you're in the right place. Now, even before my genealogy research days, I've always been interested in names. I've always wondered about those unusual names that I hear and wondered, well, how did somebody get that? And this curiosity has served me well when it comes to searching for my ancestors. Often what we see when we're looking for our ancestors are common naming patterns within the family tree. And we can use common naming patterns as clues to help us find that next generation back. Now, do naming patterns always hold true? No, of course not. But if we understand the pattern and if we understand the limitations of those patterns, we can use them in our genealogy research. Let me show you what I mean. Now let's start our conversation about naming patterns off with actually why bother with naming patterns? What is the big deal about naming patterns? And why do we want to use them as a tool in our genealogy toolbox? Well, naming patterns can do several things for us when it comes to our ancestors. They can actually give clues to relationships. So potentially we can find clues to other family relationships. For example, a child named after a grandparent can indicate perhaps a close family bond or perhaps honor a recently deceased relative. Cultural insights are another great clue when it comes to looking at names and naming patterns, because names can offer those insights into perhaps your ancestors' cultural background, their religious affiliation, and well, even some of their social status. So for instance, a biblical name might suggest a strong religious influence for that family. Now, distinguishing individuals is also very helpful when it comes to naming patterns. In times when record keeping was, well, less than precise, and we all know as genealogy researchers, we come across that, right? Naming patterns help distinguish between individuals with similar names. And this is especially useful when we are dealing with common surnames. And lastly, validating research. If a family consistently follows a particular naming pattern, finding that pattern in a new branch of your tree can provide additional confidence in your findings. One of the patterns that I actually found within my own family, one of my own family lines, was actually the family they had a first, middle, and last name, but they were known by their middle name. It was a very consistent pattern and actually one that I used to break through a brick wall because they were going by their middle name. Unfortunately for me as a researcher early into it, they were actually documented with their first name. So their first legal name was what I was seeing them in the records, but they were actually in the family going through a middle name. So this caused some confusion early in my research, but I was able to get that sorted out once I understood the pattern. All right, so what are some of these common naming patterns that we might see? So let's talk about some of those. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about is a patronymic naming pattern. Now, it's one that we see often in the Scandinavian countries where it uses the father's first name as the child's surname. So, for example, if Ole Peterson had a son named Niels, the son's full name would be Niels Olesen. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but I think we started to get the drift of that. Anyway, so that means that he is Niels, the son of Ole. Other common naming patterns. What about a biblical naming? So many families, especially those with very strong religious backgrounds, named their children after biblical figures. Now, this was very common, particularly in Puritan communities. You might also name, certainly we see this a lot, naming an ancestor after a relative. I happen to see this a lot in my Southern research that I do. And this is a very widespread naming pattern, particularly here in Western cultures. So the first son might be named after the paternal grandfather, the second son after the maternal grandfather, and the first daughter named after the maternal grandmother, the second daughter after the paternal grandmother, and so forth. So this is a very common pattern. And again, we have to keep these hold them loosely, recognize that that's a common pattern, but recognize that things can disrupt that pattern, such as the loss of a child young. So just keep that in mind. Another thing that we do see at times would be the reusing of names. So if a child died quite young, that child, it was common for that family perhaps to give that same name to the next child born of that gender. And so this is where you see some confusion in family trees. So if the first child was named after, the first son was named after the father's father or the paternal grandfather, and that child dies, then perhaps the second son who was born is named after the paternal grandfather, which would make us think that perhaps he's the first child, when in fact he was not. He would have been the second or the first son. In fact, he is the second son. So this does lead confusion. This is where we really need to make sure that in addition to recognizing these patterns, again, as a tool, we're using other records and resources like birth and death dates, birth, death records, family Bibles, to help support what our theories are using those patterns. So again, using all of these tools to work together. And then certainly another common naming pattern is going to be using a mother's maiden name or a woman's maiden name as a child's middle name. And we can actually see those come down through the family line as well. One example in my family was the fact that we had my great-grandfather's middle name was Mays. His name was Connie Mays Howard, and sometimes spelled M-A-Y-S, the most common spelling. Sometimes it was M-A-I-Z-E. I'm not 100% sure where that one came from. But nobody actually ever questioned why in the world his middle name was Mays, and why in the family Bible we were seeing several children of generations with that middle name Mays. Well, of course, enter myself, the genealogist in the family, and well, what I discovered is that several generations back, there was a woman with a maiden name of Mays who married into the family. And so that's where we picked up that name that nobody really knew quite where it came from. So this is another place that we can get a clue. Again, I picked up on that as possibly a clue and was able to follow that research plan out and discover that indeed Mays was a family line back several generations. Now, we've covered some very common patterns that we see when we're looking in our genealogy research, but let's take a look at maybe some different cultures and regions. So let's see what we have here. Now, I'm not an expert in these, I will tell you right up front, but I do know how to Google and I do know how to look for these. But in general, how might these look a little different? So if you are researching Spanish-speaking countries, what we often see is that children could traditionally receive two surnames, the first from the father and the second from the mother. So that would be actually quite helpful if you're in tracing both paternal and maternal lines. Sometimes I wish I had that in my own family, guys. It would make it easier, wouldn't it? Then also Chinese generation names. In the Chinese culture, it's common for all male cousins in the same generation to share a common character in their given name. It's called a generation name, and that can help Chinese ancestral researchers to identify which generation an ancestor belonged to. That sounds like an amazing help when it comes to researching along those naming patterns. Now, Irish and Scottish naming patterns, these do tend to be a little more like what we see in the traditional Western cultures that we were talking about earlier, where the first son would be named after the paternal grandfather, the second son after the maternal grandfather, and so forth. So this would be that's kind of a pretty common Western pattern that we've already talked about. Now, in the Jewish naming patterns, what we're seeing here would be in the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, children are often named after deceased relatives, but never after living ones. So that can actually provide some clues about certain family members and, give perhaps clues or suggest some date ranges for perhaps an individual who may have passed away and a death date. So that would be a very valuable clue to understand as well. All right, so once you've kind of figured out some of the naming patterns, maybe you're starting to recognize some of those naming patterns that, hey, I actually think I see some of those in my family tree, or I've suspected that. Let me research those out. How do naming patterns that you suspect or that you have discovered in your family tree, how does that actually help in your research? How do you use those naming patterns as part of your research? Well, first of all, we're going to document those names, all right? So we are going to make sure we are documenting the names so that we can see if we're seeing repeated names and repeated middle names. So I encourage you, certainly if you have first and middle names making sure you're including that middle name as well. Sometimes you only have the initial, sometimes you have no middle name. Middle names were not always consistently used, but when you do, go ahead and make sure that you do make note of that middle name. Again, next up, if you want to research that cultural background, so if you have found common naming patterns and you're recognizing that they are specific to a cultural background or suggesting a specific culture for your ancestor, then you can use that to research that cultural traditions and perhaps pick up on a little bit more information for your ancestors. So this is going to give you a better understanding of where your ancestor may have come from and what their views might have been. You also want to make sure that you are looking for patterns, okay? When you discover and you're looking at naming patterns in your family tree, look at patterns within that to form hypotheses about some of those family relationships. It's similar to how I discovered that pattern with my ancestors, that they always had a first and a middle name on that particular line, but they always went by their middle name. But their formal records would have been listed with their first name. So once I recognized that pattern, it was odd. It seemed to be unique to them. It's the only family line for a number of generations that does that pretty consistently. But once I recognized it, then I was able to use that and test it out and finally start making some headway a little bit more on that line, discover a few more ancestors that I didn't have two different individuals. I had the same individual just using two different names. So make sure you're doing that. It did allow me, once I discovered that pattern, to form that hypothesis to find more ancestors. And then, of course, for my personal research, the one that I've had more experience with is that traditional Western naming pattern where the first son is named after the father's father, the second son after the mother's father, that particular scenario. And so it does allow me to form some hypotheses about potential grandparents for a child, potential generations. And so that allows me to at least form a hypothesis that I can then create that research plan around and test out. When you are facing a brick wall, if you are like me, when you are facing a brick wall and you have nothing else to go on, then having that pattern and testing out common naming patterns can be very helpful in creating research plans to see if you can find a little bit more information about that family. Okay, so as you can see, names are more than just labels. And by understanding naming patterns, we can find valuable clues to our ancestors. And these clues can even help us break through genealogy brick walls. I hope this exploration of naming patterns has really inspired you to take another and closer look at the names in your family tree. If you are interested in finding free resources and websites to help you on your genealogy research, be sure and watch the video on your screen now. 10 free social history sites to improve your genealogy research.